Today, I'm speaking with Bryan Caplan, an economics professor at George Mason University and a New York Times bestselling author. His recent books include Open Borders and Build, Baby Build. Bryan, thanks for coming on the show.
Fantastic to be here.
So, I have a copy of your book, Open Borders: The Science and Ethics of Immigration. If you read through this book, it is a very accessible and straightforward, and I would say convincing argument for why open borders makes a lot of sense, even though it probably is maybe the most contentious political policy you could maybe think of. Just start by laying out your basic argument for why you think that open borders make sense.
Let's just begin with something that you really can't deny. When a rich country like the US admits a very low skilled immigrant, their wages in the labor market dramatically increase overnight. It is totally standard that if you let a Haitian in just to go and shine shoes on the streets of Miami, he's suddenly making 10 or 15 times as much as he was making back home. All right. Now, this is something where I haven't really met anyone who knows the facts who denies it, but it is such an amazing fact. It's like, so just certifying someone as being allowed to work multiplies their earnings, not 10%, not 100%. We're talking multiplying it by a factor of 10 or 15. Now, how is this possible? Really, if you know any basic economics, it comes down to, I guess, the productivity must be much higher in the receiving country than it was back in the sending country. And that's one that's very easy to see for agriculture. Working on a primitive farm, you barely grow any food. You come to a modern agribusiness and you grow a ton of food. Same thing with manufacturing. You go and switch from very simple home production in a poor country to working in a modern factory. You produce a lot more stuff. The only one where it's hard to understand a bit is services. So it's like, well, doesn't a Haitian shine shoes the same way in Miami as in Haiti? And then you realize, oh, wait a second. The point of a service is to save time. And when you save the time of people who have a higher wage, you are in fact saving more valuable time and thereby again contributing more to the world economy. Right. So anyway, this is where I start, just realizing that when you let a person in, it enriches not just the migrant by a lot, it enriches humanity. It enriches humanity. And then the question is, why would you want to stop that? Why is this something that people consider to be bad? The real answer has to be, okay, fine, we can do it for one person, we can do it for 10, we can do it for 100, do it for 1,000, but 10,000, 100,000, a million, 10 million. In other words, it's a question of the scalability.
Mhm.
How many people can a country take in without messing up this obvious and really undeniable fact, once you think about it, that letting people in dramatically raises productivity? And really, the point of open borders is to meet that challenge and say, yeah, like, is it really true that if you let in a whole lot, that something happens and what was once a incredible gain for humanity turns into a loss?
Mhm.
And for going through a lot of evidence, I say, really, the answer is no. And this is not just pure theory. So I've recently been to United Arab Emirates. This is the country with the highest foreign-born share in the world, 88% foreign-born. That means there's about, what, like 8 foreigners for every native. This is a country that has gone from being a primitive backwater in 1971 to being one of the most amazing countries on the face of the earth, and with arguably the most modern city in the history of the world, Dubai, which they could not possibly have done without letting in an enormous number of immigrants, including, of course, low skilled immigrants to do the construction work and the petroleum extraction, to be nannies, to be drivers, to be janitors. It's not just fantasy. It really is true that this is an incredible opportunity. Uh, in the book, I talk about the big number. Well, so what if it is scalable, could we accomplish with open borders? And it's something like doubling the production of humanity. Right? And what I'll say there is, if that doesn't at least pique your interest, if you're not intrigued by that, then it seems you've got a great shortage of curiosity.
It does seem that politically there's a big divide between taking in high skilled immigrants
Mhm,
versus taking in low
mhm,
skilled immigrants. What would you say to someone who says that, like, yeah, we will take people with college degrees, but if you come here not speaking the language
mhm,
and you have no skills, etc., we don't want you. Like, you need to stop at the border.
mhm.
What do you say
Yeah.
to people who make that argument?
think my first thing is, wait, you're on board with high skilled immigration? All right, let's let in 100 million high skilled immigrants because there's definitely 100 million high skilled immigrants on Earth. I'll take yes for an answer. But if they want something more fundamental, I'll say, look, if we had a fixed number of people we could let in, we can only let in a million, then it does make sense to say, let's let in the ones where the gain is going to be greatest. But we don't have that fixed number. And it is not true that people who grow food are not worthwhile people. It is not true that janitors are not worthwhile people. You don't need to be Albert Einstein to contribute to society. So I say, look, all those low skilled immigrants, they add two, and the total value that they add is a lot greater than the total value of the high skilled because there's just so many more low skilled people on Earth. It really does come down to this question: do you think that a large share of able bodied adults are actually a burden on humanity? I
Mhm.
just think that that is factually incorrect. If the janitor at your workplace died, it is not merely rude to say, oh, well, good riddance. It's also just crazy. He did
Mhm.
something useful for the business and he got paid less than the CEO, but it doesn't mean that he was a burden.
I did actually look this up while I was reading your book, and according to Purdue University, there was some study that 40% of new ag jobs go unfilled every single year.
Mhm,
And I mean, who's taking those jobs? It's not native
mhm.
born Americans, I'm assuming, right?
Right. I mean, there's always something a bit odd about the statistics because, well, you could have filled them if you raised the wage enough. But
Right,
yes, they
right.
so like there is this easy argument for immigration, which has like in some level it's making a good point, but it's not strictly correct. And that's to say, well, immigrants do the jobs Americans won't do, so there's just no loss to us. It's like, well, they would do them at a high enough wage. The better point is the wage that you have to pay an American to do them is so high that the employer would just say, I'll do without. That's
Mhm.
really obvious for things like nannies, where it's like, obviously, if you paid enough money, you could get a nanny. And yet, a lot of families, if they were paying the amount of money required to get a native to do the job, would say, I'll just stay home with my kids and I won't get a nanny because it's too cost too much.
Is there any truth to the idea that you hear on TV all the time that the immigrants are taking our jobs? You have this note in your book, which I thought was so interesting, in that there effectively is open borders for people in your position, like college
Mhm.
professors.
That's right.
So, I mean, because we take college professors from all over the world all the time, and so you
Mhm.
do actually have to compete with them at that level.
You
Whereas
do.
people who work low skilled jobs, it's a little bit of a news myth, I think, that
Mhm.
they are competing. But is there any actual like credibility to that argument that you hear people say all the time?
Yeah, of course. The problem with the argument of immigrants taking jobs isn't that they don't. The problem is that it's a totally one-sided perspective on an issue that is at least two-sided. What am I talking
Hmm.
about? Well, when you let in a foreign college professor, on the one hand, it's bad for me because I'm competing with them. On the other hand, it's good for everyone who consumes the product because it makes it cheaper. And that's true for every kind of occupation you can think of. Yes, letting in people that will work in, say, cooking is bad for people who currently have jobs in cooking. But then it's like, what about all the people who consume that product? This is a very basic point in economics as well. So there's progress, but then the progress is bad for some people. So was it really progress? There is a great way of answering this question, and it just begins with this truism: the secret of mass consumption is mass production.
Mhm.
When things lead to total greater production for humanity, it is good for humanity in general, even though it's often bad for some individuals. The internet was bad for people who worked in travel agencies. That's of course, but it was good overall because it greatly enriched humanity. The people who lose their jobs generally can go and find something else to do again. It might not be as good as what they were doing before. But if you hold back all progress because somebody loses, then you must hold back all progress because there's just no such thing as progress that doesn't have losers. The
Mhm.
only sensible thing to do is to look at the net.
So what about I mean, there are some scenarios that you see in the news.
Mhm.
I know you can't really trust the news,
The
but there are some
news.
scenarios. I know, right? There are some scenarios that my brain breaks when I try to think about how to solve this problem.
Mhm.
One is like all the immigrants that are in New York City right now, and the
Mhm.
city government just like gave them apartments or
Mhm.
hotels to live in, and it's costing hundreds of millions of dollars per year.
Mhm.
And when I try to think about that, it's like, so what do you do with these immigrants? I mean, do you ship them to other other parts of the country where they can get jobs in manufacturing or in
Mhm,
ag or something. I mean, but do we morally do? I mean, like those sorts of problems, they do break my brain when I try to think
mhm,
out like how would we solve this?
mhm.
And that is just one small, scenario. And if we were to open up the borders more, you'd see that on a grander scale, right? So, how do you think about practical issues like that?
I think if we open the borders on a much larger scale, we would see these problems go away because finally places like New York City would admit that it's absurd to go and provide hotel rooms for everybody who shows up.
Right.
The problem comes down to we have this bizarre ethic that says it's okay to keep people out, but once they're here, we got to go and give them stuff. Right?
Right.
That is very bad for the general reputation of immigrants. And it's also just not necessary. The normal thing that happens when immigrants come, like including when they come illegally, it's not they go and get stuff from government. It's that they go and find a place to stay with friends or relatives, or they work out lodgings with an employer before they come, and then they take care of themselves. Uh, so the system where you've got to take care of them. There is a New York law, which of course they could easily just change. It's one where they act like, oh, our hands are tied by who? Oh, by us.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, I mean, I like this general idea of they got to be taken care of, or this is like it's crazy. I mean, in terms of the burden, I think it's worth pointing out that natives are a far bigger burden, and people don't complain about them because it's like, of course, natives have to be supported for their entire lives, whether or not they do anything, which is another crazy idea. But yes, like it is, it makes very little sense to do it this way. It is popular because it fits in with people's emotional impulses.
Mhm.
Like, first of all, we don't want them. Second of all, if they're here, we have to treat them nicely. It's like, how about you
Right.
just treat them like adults? And like on the one hand, I'm not going to stop you from coming, but on the other hand, you've got to take care of yourself like other adults.
I like that because that does unbreak my brain
Hmm.
just to say that we're just approaching this wrong rather than
Hmm.
incorporating what we're doing, just like
Hmm.
get rid of that system and then have new approaches that will emerge. That does make sense to me. I like that.
Right. And it's
Um,
worth pointing out the countries that do have the highest foreign-born shares do exactly what I'm saying. It's not
okay.
fantasy. It's not ideology. You don't go to Emirates to go and have the government put you in a hotel.
Mhm.
You go there to get a job. And if you tried going and saying, "Where's my hotel?" There's no hotel for you, right? It's a much more reasonable system. And it's one where you don't create this illusion that a person, that a healthy, able bodied adult is a burden because they're not, unless you make them so with your silly policies.
So the other really big critique that you hear is about culture.
Hmm.
And so, for example, I follow Douglas Murray on Twitter.
Uh-huh.
He has this book, The Strange Death of Europe, and
Hmm.
basically every week he does a victory lap online about,
Hmm.
immigrants are stirring up controversy in Europe,
Hmm.
and haha, I told you so. Basically, he's saying
Yes.
this like basically every. And there are problems in Europe because of immigration,
Hmm.
and there are cultural. I mean, yeah, there are stories that you read again in the newspaper, and you don't know exactly what to believe.
Hmm.
But I think that there are some real issues there. But what would you say to Douglas Murray and the thrust of his argument about this? Like Europe is dying, like that's the claim,
Hmm.
effectively, right?
Hmm. Right. Well, I'd start off by saying, do immigrants cause problems? Of course. Do you know who else causes problems? Natives. Right. So if you just wanted to be sure that no one would ever cause a problem, just have no children, have no immigrants, and let humanity die off. When you look at a baby, can you prove that he won't become a serial killer? Like, no, you can't. We're just taking a chance here. All right. So that's where I just start with getting that on the table. And then it's a question of, all right, well, what do we see in statistics? Which you'll say, well, isn't that what he's doing? Well, maybe he's doing it, but definitely going and waiting for a news story and then taking a victory lap, that's not statistics. That is going and relying upon not just the trustworthiness of the media on a particular story, where I think they're usually okay, but on their propensity to accurately represent the state of the world, where I say the media is absolutely terrible. How so? Well, what is the point of the media? It's not to present a statistically accurate view of the world. It's to show people bad stuff that will upset them.
Mhm.
All right. So we've got like 400 million people in the EU. You will never run out of stories to upset people, no matter how good things are.
Mhm.
I mean, I would always say, like, what is way better than watching the news? Just firsthand experience is a lot better than watching the news. So if you don't want to do statistics, just go around Europe, go to places that are supposed to be living hell because of immigrants. I have, and you'll see, yeah, it's fine. Right? This is just a giant pile of catastrophism, of Chicken Little saying the sky is falling. I've gone to Malmö. I've gone to places in Europe where people say, oh, it's a horrible no-go zone. It's like, yeah, it's fine. Right? I'd much rather be there than be in a bad neighborhood in America, honestly. Right? But now, when we get to what is relevant is statistics, it's like, well, isn't it true that immigrants in Europe, especially Muslim immigrants, have higher crime rates? Like, yes, that's true.
Mhm.
All right. Worth pointing out, in the United States, not immigrants have much lower crime rates than natives. So it's like, all right, so it's complicated at least. Let's go and make distinctions here. But then there's the question of, all right, does the fact that a group has a higher crime rate than average mean that you don't want them? Well, I hope you're not going to say that, because we have one gender that has about 10 times the crime rate of the other gender. And that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that we should be doing selective abortion for all male babies to avoid crime. It's like, all right, well, it is a bad thing about them. If we have some better way of dealing with male crime, great. But on the other hand, to say that because they are especially bad by this one measure, that therefore they are bad overall, is crazy. Right? And that's really how I come down to the measurable problems. Now, sometimes when people talk about culture, it's just a je ne sais quoi, where like it's I can't really put my finger on exactly what it is, and
Mhm.
that's where I'll say, that sounds pretty vague. Why don't we stick to something that we can actually measure? Although then the next thing is, all right, fine. If we are going to think about these intangibles, let's at least try to measure assimilation. So, how
Mhm.
long does it take before the kids of immigrants wind up looking like people that are otherwise in the country already? And that's another thing I'll say, that assimilation is actually very high. The share of apostasy among Muslim immigrants to Europe gets rarely covered, but yeah, it's quite high actually. A lot higher than it would have been if they'd stayed home.
Right, that makes sense, and probably you're drawing a lot of people who already are sympathetic to apostasy, right?
Yeah, so that's less clear. Probably maybe a little bit. I mean, I think it is true that a lot of immigrants come hoping to preserve their culture and make sure their kids don't change, and then they're usually disappointed because they are in a totally different culture, and it is human nature to conform to the culture around you. Uh, of course, there's a few nonconformists who resist, but otherwise, yeah.
So I could actually imagine a world where Douglas Murray is correct in the sense that, let's take Germany.
Mhm,
Germany does not have a replacement rate with children at the moment.
mhm,
And let's say that they just open up their borders and get
mhm,
floods of immigrations from, like, they take everyone from Syria, right?
mhm,
And then in 50 years, they institute Sharia law and they just
mhm,
can, because of the population, the demographics have
mhm,
changed that drastically. In that case, like, Douglas Murray was right. Because I mean, that's what he's saying is going to
mhm,
happen. And he could technically be right, right? I mean, there's like
mhm.
technically.
Yeah, so like it is logically possible. My forecast is that the Syrian population would heavily assimilate to, well, to German norms, and it would mostly be their culture that would disappear, not the German one.
Hmm.
I would not be surprised if the population became nominally Muslim and yet majority Muslim, and yet just didn't take it very seriously. And then someone might go and say, well, they have a law against blasphemy that goes and gives you 3 months in jail. And I say, like, I disagree with that. That's unfortunate. Right? Is that as bad as letting a million people die in a civil war? It's like, no, it's not as bad as that.
I have one more just broad question about
Mhm,
immigration, that you hear this again all the time from people in the media saying that, like, this truism that if you don't have borders, you don't have a country, kind of full
mhm,
stop. How do you envision what a country is, like, in theory, if there are no borders?
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I would start with, so if there's no borders, are there no states? Right. So, like, does Arkansas need border checks to be Arkansas? I don't
Okay,
think so.
great point.
Right? So we're like within the EU. So if you have a bunch of countries with open borders, do they cease to be countries then? It's really just a weird definitional argument where it doesn't even really fit the definition. But yeah, so it's not a very good argument.
I agree. Okay, I agree. I want to turn to your book, Build Baby Build,
Right.
and let me start with a very basic question. Why is housing so expensive in America right now?
Yeah, great question. And the overwhelming answer is that government strangles the industry with very strict regulation, that makes it very hard to build stuff. We've got the technology to build an enormous amount of housing cheaply, even in very desirable areas by going more vertically and being more dense. Governments withhold permission, and so the technology cannot generally be used. The only place you can build very freely is in the middle of nowhere, and like that's exactly where you don't want to go and build very much. People want to build around other people, and governments just make it really hard to do that.
What sorts of policies should the average voter vote for if they just want more housing to be built?
Hmm. I mean, of course, normally you don't directly get to vote on this stuff. There's some states with referenda where if there's a referenda that deregulates housing, then I'll say, yeah, totally vote to deregulate housing.
Mhm,
If it's a question of voting for representatives, then I'd say vote for whoever is more pro housing. That does require people to find out who that is. I'd say like whoever is more dismissive of complaints about housing. So, the real problem is that complainers have an enormous amount of influence in housing policy. They're the ones that show up at meetings. And yet, the reason they're so powerful is that other people take them seriously.
mhm.
If they were just considered to be terrible people who are messing up the world, then they say like, "I'll go to the media." It's like, yeah, you go to the media. Everybody hates you anyway. They know how ridiculous you're being. You want to stop $1 billion skyscraper over a bird? Get the hell out of here. But unfortunately, in the real world, those people are good at getting public sympathy, and they'll say
Mhm.
just out of greed they want to go and displace this noble bird. Instead of rolling their eyes and laughing at that person, it's easy to get a lot of attention for that kind of complaint.
Is it okay at some level though if we do just let some cities kind of ossify and become museum cities? You get this like the sense
Mhm,
of this when you go to Europe, and that it's
mhm.
not exactly like their populations are growing, and so they have just kind of like let their cities become museums, and it seems kind of okay. Like if we were to do that with some American cities like San Francisco, which just moved out of recently because it was too expensive, would that
Ah,
be kind of okay?
yeah. So my position is no, it's totally not okay. Uh, Comes down to this. Look, there are market forces that do encourage historical preservation. One thing is consumer demand. There's a lot of people that like historic buildings, so they will pay a premium for them.
Mhm,
There's tourism. If something's historic, then you can go and make money off of tourism. There's philanthropy. There are people that will pay money to go and maintain an historic building just because they think it's so wonderful and lovely. And I say, like those three incentives, that's all the protection we should have. And other than that, the property owners should be allowed to do what they want with it and to respond to the changing nature of the world. These museum cities, standardly, they are the highest earning places in those countries.
mhm.
And because of those high rents, because of these museum preservation policies, most people can't afford to move there and live there. The reason why their population in those cities is stagnant is because it's just so expensive to live there. I was in Budapest. That's a great example of a museum city. They have one skyscraper in the entire city, and that's just like 40 stories. It's not wouldn't be even be considered notable in other places. The pay in Budapest is much higher than the rest of the country, but other people can't afford to live there and move to opportunity. So I'd
Mhm.
say that's totally a place where it'd be much better to go and deregulate it. There's some stuff that's going to go and pass the market test. And the rest, I say, like, let's just see what happens and why assume it's going to be worse. San Francisco, you might have noticed in the book, I've got a helicopter shot of San Francisco. When someone says, "Oh, you can't build more as a peninsula," most of the peninsula just has these 2 and 3 story buildings. If a developer could just go and buy up a city block and knock them down or replace them with skyscrapers, they totally would. And like, why is that considered worse? Right? Just because this is what we're used to?
Yeah, San Francisco is hilarious. I think you almost like undersell that point because the whole entire west side of San Francisco, once you get over the Twin Peaks, it is just it's not beautiful Victorians that people
Mhm,
picture as being San Francisco. It's not Dolores Park. It's these
mhm,
very kind of like old school 1950s boring,
mhm.
not
Yeah,
attractive
yeah. Well,
houses.
that's which is what you'd buy first probably because that's the
Yeah,
lowest
and I've
value.
I've been in a lot of them. Like, they're not
Yeah.
nice, cool, artsy houses like you
Mhm,
picture San Francisco houses
yeah.
being again. And you yeah, just, like, buy up a city block and Exactly what you're saying. I mean, so many more people could be squeezed in there if you just like that whole side of the city that no one even
Right,
knows
and maybe they
exists
wouldn't even
anyway.
need to be squeezed. If the housing got cheap enough, you could live spaciously there.
Right. Yeah, I follow a lot of YIMBY accounts on Twitter, and you always see these cases where I think there's one yesterday in New Jersey where someone had a picture of people say you can't build housing anymore in cities, but there was this one, I think it was like a Taco Bell that was knocked down, and they put up like a 40-story building housing hundreds of people where a Taco Bell used to be, right? So I mean, like there is space, we just don't even think about it in that sense.
Mhm. Right. I mean, like once you start actually studying housing regulation by, say, reading my book, have you got a copy there, by the way?
Not with me, no, I don't.
Not with you. All right. So, oh, actually, guess what? Yeah, I do.
There we go.
So once you start studying it, I'll say it's the kind of thing where you can't unsee it. You'll just look at any construction site and realize the reason why they're building it that way isn't that they wanted to, it's because government made them. Whenever you see valuable land with one house per acre, they didn't want to do that. The government made them go and have one house per acre. They wanted to go and put six homes per acre. Because actually, most people are not willing to pay a lot of money just for extra land.
Mhm.
They might like an acre if it's free, but if it's a matter of how do we maximize the amount of money on this one piece of land, if the land is valuable, then it's going to be by putting a lot of nice homes close together, which means a lot more people get to live there.
I have a little bit of a skepticism about the idea that if you build more, it will lower prices. Just
All right.
because I feel, yeah, let me run this by you.
Mhm.
Density is desirable. People
Mhm.
want to live, especially people with high
Mhm.
incomes with nice jobs. They want to live in dense urban environments.
Mhm.
And so if you look at cities like Vancouver, BC, where they did build a ton of housing,
Mhm.
it's still incredibly expensive no matter how many condos they put up because of like the density just draws people. And I feel like in the sense, San Francisco is always going to be incredibly expensive because it is so
But it
walkable
wasn't
and
always
desirable.
expensive. It was
Okay.
way cheaper relative to inflation in 1970, like very cheap actually. My
Is
mother said,
is it true?
yeah,
Yeah, you're totally
yeah,
right. I am so
yeah,
biased by having moved there in
yes,
the 2020s.
yeah.
But
Like people bought those homes for like $10,000 in 1970, I think. That's when I did. We need to double check. Don't really have the numbers in my head, but they were real
the
cheap
idea
in
of that
those
makes me
days,
sick, but yeah.
right? I mean, so what I would say is, look, it's true that moving more people into an area can make it more desirable, and that
Mhm,
tends to somewhat balance out at first the reduction in prices just from greater supply. But the idea that like no matter how many you build, it won't change anything, that's wrong. Right? Like the real story is that when there is enormous demand, prices are really high, then they can go and allow a lot of new units, and it just doesn't make that much of a dent in it. But along the way, they're still making it really hard to build. It's just that if the prices get high enough, then people will do what it takes to get over that threshold. But I'll just say, like, just double and double and double again, and there's always a point where you make it so abundant that it will be cheap. I mean, this is something where you can look at like almost like any other markets that you can
mhm.
think of and just say, look, like if you make enough of it, will it be cheap? Right. And it's like, if you made enough computers, would they be cheap? That would have seemed crazy in 1950. And it might be, it's a pretty similar argument, actually. Well, the more computers there are, there's this network effect, more people want them. And yet, we have actually seen prices per unit of processing crash because
Mhm.
production is just so massive, and governments are not there to go and just say, look, you can only have a 10% increase, right?
Right,
Which does seem
right.
like a lot for housing. It's like 10% more housing. Well, maybe what we need is 1,000% more housing.
Mhm. Yeah, boy, I want to ask you about that in a second. But first, I do think it's interesting that a lot of people have actually just totally written off San Francisco and given up on it, including a
Mhm.
lot of the
Yeah.
tech billionaires.
Mhm.
And so there's this new project called California Forever, where between
Mhm.
SF and Sacramento,
Yeah, yeah,
they're
I'm
going to be
familiar. I know those guys. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
I'm
A
sure
little
you
bit.
do. And so they
Mhm.
want to build a new city out there.
Mhm.
Are you optimistic about projects like that? And maybe even not just California Forever, but also maybe The Line in Saudi Arabia, and there's a bunch of these. I think even Disney wants
Yeah.
to start their own city, right? Are you optimistic about these projects? Do you think they're a good idea?
I think it would be great to give them a chance. My main pessimism is just I doubt the government will let it really proceed. The
Mhm.
question is, will they have a light enough hand that it still works out, or will they just crush it? And that I don't know. The line in Saudi Arabia, that's a giant government doing boondoggle, and
Mhm.
I wouldn't be surprised if they got it done just by throwing $1 trillion at it, but I think that's a bad idea.
Right.
Um, let's see. Yeah, and by the way, going back to your other point, we can actually see that there are cities where, on the one hand, they've had a lot of people move there, and they become more desirable because there's more cool stuff going on. Yet prices have remained very reasonable, and like mostly in Texas. So,
Mhm.
I mean, of course, like in Texas, like there are areas with higher regulation, but still compared to San Francisco, it's nothing. If you want to get a cheap place in the San Antonio or Austin area, you can just drive out to the middle in between the two places, and then you can get a really nice home for a few $100,000. People there, it's like $300,000. That's a ripoff. And like if you told someone in San Francisco they could get a 4,000 square foot single family home for $400,000, I
Yeah.
think they would consider that a pretty good deal.
Yeah, exactly. Do you, I mean, you see a lot of articles and videos about how the suburbs are a Ponzi scheme and kind of a scam, and just because of the infrastructure that costs so much to, they need a higher and higher tax base in order to pay
Mhm.
for the infrastructure maintenance, et cetera. Is there any truth to that, or are suburbs actually economically sustainable?
Hmm. There's a bunch of things going on. I would say that like deregulation would make suburbs a lot better. Um, Mainly, they would become a bit marginally less suburban. They would still be comfortably on the suburban side. So I think with deregulation, the main thing would happen in suburbs is just a lot more single family homes on a small amount of land. So I think that's the main
Right.
thing. It would still be suburban. It would look more like suburbs in the 50s, except the land amount would be similar, but the home size would just take over almost the entire lot. That's what we see generally when builders are able to get their way in, at least with reasonably valuable land. They want to build a bunch of McMansions right next to
Mhm.
each other, right? So I think that's what the main challenge would be. In terms of being a Ponzi scheme, I think that's a strange idea. It's true that there was a big growth of suburbs because of partly because of white flight. So when crime got really bad in major cities, then there was a lot of white flight. Then people moved to suburbs. Then, if you'd go and make cities a lot nicer, so partly things like crime, partly it's just deregulating so that it's affordable. That would be bad for suburbs. But flip side is if you made suburbs better, that would be bad for cities.
Mhm.
The main thing you have in mind is, well, no one is a city, no one is a suburb. The better thing to think about is it good for humans to have abundant housing and a lot of different kinds of choices? And I'll say, yeah, of course, it's good for humans to have abundant housing and a lot of different choices.
So I am fascinated by this topic of the population collapse that they say is
Mm,
imminent around 2085, and it relates to a lot of these issues.
yes.
But right now, even this moment, about half of American cities are currently in population decline.
Mhm.
And I've talked to some, urban planner folks about this, and they genuinely just do not want to talk about this issue.
Mhm.
There's a video on, I think it's like Wired's YouTube channel, of this guy, Alexandros Washburn, who's a former chief urban designer of New York City. And he's very pro build. He's, like, if we need to build one of them, let's build three of them. Like that's his
Mhm.
mentality. But he has this quote that's just kind of like thrown in because he was asked what's the biggest problem for urban planning looking in the future. He says the biggest challenge for urban planning looking 50 years ahead is what are we going to do when population starts to plateau and decline? And then all the pressure on build more and new and better is not there, and we have to deal with what we have. What are your thoughts on this topic?
Mhm. It's totally possible, and we've seen it's often the case that there are certain areas can be having the population decline, and yet there's other areas that are growing very rapidly. So a lot of what happened with cities is that farm areas of the U.S., which is most of the rural areas, most of the land in the United States, lost population, and then
Mhm.
those people moved to cities, and then cities started losing out to suburbs. So we've seen things like this before. Um, like the general point I would say is like to really understand what's going on, you need to answer this tough question of like, are humans good? Are humans bad? Or say, well, that's too simplified. All right, fine. Like given our current population, would be better if we had more humans, fewer humans, or the same number of humans. I have a whole book called Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids,
Mhm.
which is mostly about parenting, but I do have a chapter there on the social effects of population. And what I say is, I think that while there's some obvious negatives of population, there are even bigger non-obvious positives. Uh, like, is there some upper limits? Sure, there's some upper limit. I don't know what it is, but I think that we are nowhere close to that upper limit. So it would be better overall uh, if we did have a lot more people. Some of this is just philosophical of saying, like, will the next person be born be glad to be alive? Yes. Will they contribute to society? Yes. Then it's good if that we have another person, and like, hard to argue with that. In terms of like why people are even so uncomfortable discussing this issue, a lot of it, I think, is that it just feels vaguely kind of like it might be anti-feminist,
Mhm.
and people are so worried about that, and that's such a sacred value that they just don't even want to talk about something that might possibly get them talking about something that where they could be accused of being anti-feminist. It's to me, it's odd. Is it's like the connection between birth rates and feminism is another interesting question, but
Mhm.
let's go and solve one question at a time. Like, new babies born, all right, good or bad? Let's talk about that first.
Yeah, so I do have one daughter, and I would be curious to have a second child, or I'm interested in having a second child, I should
Mhm.
say. But it
Good
does
thing
come
you
down
got
to
out of San
money.
Francisco.
Yeah, that's why actually we had a baby, had to move out of San Francisco. Well,
Got
I
to.
know you wrote a book about
You
this,
you got to move out.
right?
The
Yeah.
privilege of leaving San Francisco.
Yeah. Live in Sacramento now, so it's quite a bit cheaper, but still, expensive coastal-ish city. What
Wow,
I've
I've
not
been out
read
of
your book on this.
California for 30 years, but during the 22 years I lived there, no one ever called Sacramento coastal or coastal-ish.
Everyone from the Bay has moved here, and they're actually building stuff. So it's actually
What are you, like 2 hours from the ocean?
less than that. It's like an hour
Uh,
40.
hour
Hour
four. All
40.
right, still.
Yeah. Yeah, but, yeah, there are so many transplants from the Bay, including myself, that, you even see, like, local restaurants, like, San Francisco restaurants are now opening up here. It's very funny. Um, but yeah, again, I've not read your book on parenting and children. What is, like, your quick pitch for why it's maybe economically smart to have a second, third, fourth child?
Right. It's probably going to be something really different from what you're thinking, actually. Um, the key foundation of selfish reasons to have more kids is this body of research called behavioral genetics, where they study twins and adoptees to understand why do humans turn out the way that they do. Real quick version is that the punchline of this research is that, at least within first world countries, we greatly underestimate nature, especially in the long run, and we greatly overestimate nurture, especially in the long run. Uh, so what? Well, there's this popular parenting style, which we often make fun of as helicopter parenting, which is all premised on the idea that nurture is crucial for kids to turn out well, and that's why to be a decent parent, you basically have to go and give up having almost any fun or relaxation, or else you're giving your kid a bad future. So the foundation of my book is saying wrong. That is not true. In fact, there's a wide range of parenting styles that generally give you about the same adult outcomes. And once you accept that, then the optimal number of, well, first of all, like the optimal parenting style changes, because things that you don't like, your kid doesn't like, you're
Mhm.
doing for the future. It's like, okay, well, it really doesn't have that benefit. So we can just stop. But then, secondly, once you give yourself a break, then it makes sense to say, now that I've changed the way that I raise my kids, it also changes the number of kids that I should want to have. Around the time the video came out, there was this essay on what I call soccer is contraception. It was by a mom who said, well, we got two kids, they're both in soccer. Shuttling them around to these soccer games takes up our entire lives.
Yeah.
Talking about having a third kid. Then we said, look, we can't handle a third set of chauffeuring. And then briefly said, well, what about have a third kid and don't take him to soccer? Like, no, absolute disaster. Kids need soccer to have any decent future. And I said, all right, well, I'm just reversing this reasoning and saying, since it is not true that you need to have your kids going to soccer for them to have a decent future, then in fact, you could totally responsibly and reasonably have another kid and in fact, cut out the soccer for all of them if you don't like it and,
Mhm.
and not feel the least bit bad about it.
Yeah, no, I do totally buy that. I think that's a great point. Helicopter parenting
All
is
right. So you have another kid then. Did I talk you into it?
well, this is my next question is that
Yeah, because that book is the only thing I've ever written that actually demonstrably improved the world. Everything else is just sort of being a voice in the wilderness. But that book, I talked hundreds of people into having more kids, which the way economists measure these things, I've added billions of dollars of value with that book. Of course, I got a very small share of those billions, but nevertheless, it did something good.
maybe I should read that book. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot there for me. But do you have any thoughts on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea for governments to incentivize childbirth? I mean, because I remember that Kamala, when she was running for president, she was going to give $6,000 tax break for having children to help out with daycare
Mhm,
costs. I mean, like I'm again moved out of San Francisco because
mhm,
daycare was $2,400 a month, which is insane.
mhm.
And then like here in Sacramento, I think we pay like 1,400 or something like that. So drastically cut but that's still a lot of money. Like that's a ton
Sure.
of money. And that's like 3 or 4 years you have to pay that out of
Mhm,
pocket, right? And
mhm.
do you think the government should incentivize people to have kids by covering some of those
Mhm.
costs, or do you think this isn't the government's role?
Right. So I have a piece where I went and found estimates of two things. First of all, just from the point of view of taxpayers, how good or bad is a new baby, considering the baby is going to use some government services, will eventually probably become a taxpayer.
Mhm.
Secondly, there are some estimates of how responsive is family size to government incentives, right? And I then put these two things together, and what I calculated is that baby bonuses of almost any kind more than pay for themselves. So really, they are the holy grail of tax policy,
Hmm.
where by cutting taxes, you actually raise tax revenue. Not, of course, in the year the baby's born, but
Mhm.
you are improving the long run budget situation. So, and that's not ignoring all the other good things that human beings do. That's purely looking at from the point of view of taxpayers as cattle and are they worth it? And from the point of view of the government, and the answer is yeah, it's actually worth it. Now, in terms of what's the best way of doing it, like if you've got some concerns about government going and having overreach, my favorite approach is how about just a tax holiday for, say, a year, the year that you have a kid, or
Oh,
you
okay.
give it 2 years or 3 years. So that way, it's not the government is actually paying you; they're just letting you keep more of your own money. I think it also is better in terms of being worried about encouraging people that are not responsible enough to take care of themselves to have kids. So if it's just a non-refundable tax credit, it just reduces, means that the taxes that you pay are reduced or zero for a while. Then it doesn't have that problem either. But honestly, in terms of the gains, I think that almost anything along these lines is probably a good idea. Um, there's a lot of people who have claimed that baby bonuses don't work based upon, well, a country had declining birth rates, they adopted a baby bonus, and the birth rate didn't reverse or kept going
Mhm.
down. Again, this is very similar to the housing prices thing of, well, maybe they needed to be bigger, maybe it needed to be a lot bigger. Hungary famously has a law saying that once a woman has 4 kids, she doesn't have to pay income taxes for the rest of her life, which sounds great until you realize, well, wait a second, how many women with 4 kids have jobs?
Right. Yeah.
And it doesn't go and excuse the dad. So it's like, it's more symbolic. I love it because my wife has a great job and we've got 4 kids. So it's like, yeah, awesome. So, but yeah, it would affect rare people. So it's one where you need to think a bit harder about exactly what is the best way to go and hand out the money. Um, but like in general, I think that uh, at minimum, just saying we're going to go and reduce taxes for people with kids makes a lot of sense. Of course, like a flip side of it would be to say that retirement benefits are going to depend upon the number of kids that you have. So
Mhm.
you had no kids, then you're going to get Social Security check will be smaller because you didn't create any people that actually sustain the system.
That makes a lot of sense for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And then you could say, well, how about your Social Security check is based upon the taxes your kids pay. So if you have a kid but he goes to jail, then it doesn't help, like that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And again, this is where people start seeing slippery slopes, and maybe they should. But Um,
A lot of that you don't even hear talked about. So, yeah, just getting that into the conversation, some of those thoughts, I think is great and very fascinating. I want to ask you about a couple of things that I have not seen you talk so much about.
all right.
The first, I want to hear your thoughts on Doge, Elon Musk's
Mm-hmm.
Department of Government Efficiency. Are you a fan or no fan?
Yeah, definitely a fan. I think both Musk and Vivek have at least a lot of good ideas. Not all good, but they've got unusually a large number of good ideas for anyone with any influence in public life. So like, I'm hopeful, which I almost never am about anything in politics. It's
What do you
probably
say?
actually I'm more hopeful about that than anything else that I've heard about in years.
What do you say to the critique that they're kind of just like looking at maybe, rounding off pennies here and there, whereas like the government spends so much money on the military and
Mhm.
healthcare and retirement, and those are the things they're probably most likely not going to touch at all. What do you say to that?
Like I'll just say, too soon to tell. Like some of the things they're talking about sound very big. I don't think it even is Doge, but there's some talk about adding work requirements back to Medicaid, which I think is a really good idea, and that's a big deal. Or just being, having some stricter means testing. There are a lot of regulations that are very wasteful. And like definitely if you just add a bunch of them up, like I'm actually so like in terms of things that I'd be most optimistic about. So I think that Vivek has some very good understanding of energy policy. So I think that it's realistic that he would remove some very silly regulations on fossil fuels and also push for deregulation of nuclear power.
I'm
So
a
I
big
think
fan of
that
that. Yeah.
so again, like I said, hopeful, not confident, right? And so that's one. And then I think he also is familiar with the great harm that has been done by civil rights laws, so called. Uh, I'm a big fan of Richard Anania's work on this. I think that he has a very strong case that what we think of as DEI overreach really comes out of this almost impossible situation that employers are in where they never get in trouble for being too attentive to complaints, but they get in a
Mhm.
lot of trouble for being dismissive of complaints. We've created a system where basically anyone in a protected class can go and blackmail employers with their offense. Right? And it's one where, as I explained in a piece called Lawsuits Are the Hitman of the State, a lot of what has happened with civil rights laws is they've been used to go and censor and otherwise regulate things that constitutionally would never be allowed. So think about this. If the federal government would have passed a law saying no one can make any racist comments on the job, that would be overturned by the Supreme Court almost for sure.
Mhm.
But if they pass a law saying that you can sue employers for discrimination and part of its discrimination is failure to go and fire people for saying racist things, that's okay. And that is the system that we have where we basically outsource the enforcement to lawsuits and yet and pretend that it's just private, but of course it's not private at all. The government has said that you can sue for this stuff. So I mean, when people were very upset that Texas, before Roe was overturned, people were very upset when Texas said that there's a private right to sue an abortionist and say,
Oh.
yeah, well, isn't that really like the same thing as government banning it? And it was engineered by legal scholars to avoid that constraint. And yet, look, obviously, it's the same thing. Just like
Mhm.
it's like hiring a hitman to do your dirty work instead of killing someone yourself and saying, I didn't do anything. It's like, well, of course you did.
Would you prefer for Musk and Vivek to decrease government spending or to decrease regulations across the board so that more can get done? Or is that a false dichotomy?
So I doubt that they're going to have much room to change spending. Normally, that is very much in the hands of Congress, whereas regulation is in the executive branch. So I think that's where they've got the most opportunity.
Mhm.
I think it's also where it is easiest to go and make a big difference. So, like basically, when you're taking people's money away from them, there's like they fight really hard. On the other hand, a lot of the reason why regulation is so horrible is that the costs to society are so much greater than the benefits to the gainers, which is much
Right.
less true for spending. So
Right.
I think,
Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah, so if you just think about this, how much would someone have to pay the typical worker to waive the right to ever sue their employer? It's like you're in the
Hmm.
interview and you can check a box, like I waive my right to sue, and in exchange I get an extra this salary bump. I think most people would waive the right to sue for a couple $100.
I think so too.
Like
Yeah.
it's just not, you know, like and yet employers really want to go and stop these lawsuits because it's an enormous burden, not just the settlement and the lawyers, but just having to always be worrying about what you do and say, right? And just to be able to finally once again hire and fire based upon meritocracy.
So regulating AI, pro or con?
Yeah, very con. Uh, I
What
mean, I'm
about the
fond of just the
doomsday
constitutional
scenarios,
argument that
Brian?
AI is just speech, so the Supreme Court should just say, look, it is it is illegal for government to do anything about this. All they're doing is having a program where you put in some words and it turns out some other words. So
Mhm.
like but like like my main view is that the dangers are really low and the gains are quite promising. And we already know what happens when you take an industry like that and let government regulate it a little bit, which is they strangle it, see nuclear power. So
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
So
a lot more worried about government strangling something that could have been awesome than about the Terminator scenario or anything along those lines.
yeah, my take is that the doomsday scenarios seemed way more believable before we started becoming more familiar with AI because it's less of an alien now and more part of just like day-to-day life in a sense. But I
You
mean,
know, of course, the
I have
pessimists will always say that's just what the AI wants you to think.
right. I know I do have some time for the doomsdayers. I totally do, but
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things that seems too inevitable and we shouldn't slow it down. That's kind of my
Mhm.
take.
Yep. Full speed ahead. Totally.
Okay, I have two more. Cryptocurrency.
Mhm. First of all, you should not take anything I say about this very seriously because when I first heard about it, I was dismissive and thought it would never work. Right?
Mhm.
I'm just going to I'm going, mea culpa. I met some college kids wearing their early I use coin, Bitcoin shirts. And my reaction was, yeah, or why don't you go move to your own island? And they were totally right. And I was totally wrong. Um, Only later did I talk to people who knew more about it and said, okay, so like the fundamental value is for black market activity. I was like, now I understand. It's not just a Ponzi scheme. It's not just bigger fool theory. Rather, what's going on is that it does have this fundamental value for illegal transactions. In general, I'm pro illegal transactions. So things that make illegal transactions easier, I think, are great. Um, I was a student of Ken Rogoff, who has a famous book on why we should ban cash, and I'll just say that his analysis is sound, except
Hmm.
that he begins by saying, "Well, unless you think that illegal transactions are good," and yeah, I think illegal transactions are good in general.
Can you spell that out a little bit more? Why are illegal transactions good? In terms of like, I don't know, moving tons of fentanyl across countries and then paying through cryptocurrency is, I mean, I see like death resulting in some illegal activity. And what's
Yeah,
the
I don't
upside
need
to
to
that?
praise all illegal transactions. Say, like, I think vast majority of black market activity is good stuff, and could have to go into a lot more detail, but that's where I'm coming from.
So are you part of the free Ross movement? Do you think that Ross Ulbricht should be
I've never lifted a finger for Ross, but I hope he gets out. Absolutely.
supposedly Trump might actually let him out. That was one of the
Yeah, well,
things
he
that I
said it
think.
once, and I would say that one is a fool to believe something that Trump said once. But
Right. That's true.
although that doesn't mean it won't happen. The
Hmm.
fact that he said something once, especially if it's super low cost and will upset a bunch of his enemies, that's like, all right, maybe he will.
Excellent. Yep, I agree. That's what I think too. Last question here. You write a lot about provocative topics. Basically, you take any one of your books. I haven't read them all, but
Mhm.
I'm familiar with them. It's all a very provocative
Mhm.
topic, almost like a third rail for some of
Mhm.
them. What's a provocative topic or dangerous idea that you think that society isn't yet ready to hear?
Hmm. I don't know about society, but I have some controversial views on the Israel-Palestine conflict that will just upset almost everybody,
Mm.
and I don't feel like going and dealing with them because they're two of the most impossible groups of people to talk to.
Right.
So,
Yeah, boy, if we had more time, that would be a fun discussion.
well, I'm not going to do it. I mean, I thought about putting it into a stand-up comedy routine, and like I think I could get a lot of hits for it, but I just don't feel like dealing with all the screaming.
Right. Yep. That makes sense. So, what are you working on next? Do you have any other books coming
Mm,
out?
yes, I've got a big university press style book that is about two-thirds done called Unbeatable: The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets. The real quick slogan of this book is markets do the good things that sound bad, governments do the bad things that sound good. This explains, first of all, why people so underrate markets and overrate government, but also why it's so hard to convince anybody because the intellectually cogent arguments are really ugly. And what I do in this book is it's just a book of pure, unvarnished, brutal truth where I say these are the correct arguments. They're the ones that are intellectually sound. I don't pretend they're going to convince many people, but I'm going to say it anyway because I just want the truth to be written down somewhere and by me.
Is that coming out 2025 or?
The way that lags work, I think I can finish in less than a year, but then it takes another year to actually go through the refereeing process and come to print. So, like, probably if we add on the slack that you should, then like early 2027 is a reasonable forecast for when the book's in your hands.
Okay, great. Looking forward to that. Well, Bryan Caplan, thank you for coming on the show. That was a lot of fun.
But my pleasure. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.